So let me just talk perhaps a little bit about what these two ideals of this ideal of freedom, this ideal of a mixed constitution, in effect this idea of democracy, because that's the name really by which I think we should know the mixed constitution nowadays. Let me talk a little bit about both of those. So what does freedom as non-domination in a contemporary world require? First of all, it requires that everybody is protected in a certain range of choices. The crucial, central, fundamental choices are, as we say, liberties that are important in social life. They include, of course, the liberties of thought, liberties of speech, liberties of practice, religious practice or the absence of religious practice, liberties of association, of associating with others, or at least with any others who have you associate with them, liberties of movement within your society, your country, and of course liberties of employment. These are the basic liberties where it's the domain within which we require powerful protection. So those are the choices. Second thing that's important for freedom as non-domination is that we, all of us, are protected in these fundamental choices on the same basis. So, for example, we don't rely on private security guards for our protection. We don't rely, if you like, on a sort of private mafia. We each rely on a common law, a law that protects each of us equally. We each rely on a powerful culture that protects each of us equally, a culture that will say every one of us in this culture is sacred. Every one of us represents ground that others cannot trample on with impunity. That sort of culture is required to back up the formal law in giving each of us a sense of being proof, being more or less immune against the pressures that others might exercise over us. The ideal is that we should have such protection on this basis that we can each look one another in the eye. That's an old Republican metaphor, that you're free only if you can look others in the eye without fear and without deference, as in, wanting to please. That we can each look one another in the eye knowing that, each of us conscious that we can't be pushed around by others, and recognizing equally that others can't be pushed around by us. In order to have this protection in these central choices on this common basis, it's not enough to just have a law that gives us certain rights. We've equally got to have protections of those rights, of course, but as well as that, we've got to have certain powers that we can call upon. And we've got to have options, other things we can do. Now, at this stage, in order to make this more concrete, let me give a couple of examples. And I'm going to choose two literary examples. They're safer, they're more colourful, they're more fun. Although, of course, it might be better to choose exact contemporary examples. However, the examples I've taken are, the first is from Ibsen's play, A Doll's House. Now, Ibsen, if you remember in that play, it centred on the figure of a woman, Nora, with a husband, Thorvald. And Nora lives, of course, under the power of Thorvald. This is 19th century Scandinavia, and the law is very much on his side, and she's not allowed, basically, do anything except with his permission. That means, in Republican terms, of course, that she's not free. Although Thorvald is a really, really nice master, a very kindly, benevolent master. In fact, if you remember the play, Thorvald more or less gives Nora anything she wants. She can spend the money they have on anything. She can go and come from the house. She can appear with friends, she can go away, she can do everything actually if I remember, other than eat a certain sort of candy or confectionery called macaroons. I don't know whether they exist much in Spain, but he forbids her macaroons. That's the only interference in her life that Thorvald practices. But even that she gets away with, because she hides the macaroons in her dress, if you remember. Large 19th century dress will hide the candy. So she's got totally free reign in the metaphor that I used earlier. But boy, she clearly is not free. And that's what Ibsen lets us see. Because there is someone with a hand on those reins, and that's Thorvald. She lives in Thorvald's, her husband's, power. In the Latin phrase that the Roman Republicans used, she lived in potestate domini, in the power of a master. And he lets us see what that sort of unfreedom is. Now, Bentham wouldn't have worried about Nora. He'd have said that Nora is free because she's not actually interfered with. But in the Republican way of thinking, and for example, the Republican way of thinking that those of us associated with neo-Republicanism would like to revive, Nora is the very epitome, the exemplar of unfreedom. Although she's lucky, it could be worse. She could have a husband that abused her. He didn't, but he still made her unfree. In order to be free, Nora would have to have protection of her rights against Thorvald. In those days, the law did not look within the home. A man's home really was his castle. What happened within the walls was not the business of the law. She would have to have rights protected. She would have to have some power, I suspect, against her husband, in the sense that, for example, she could divorce him. She had the right to divorce him if he did abuse her. Without that power, remember, no protection of the law would work very well. And she had to have not just rights protected and powers, but she had to have options. For example, somewhere else she could go. And that's actually a crucial theme in the play, that there didn't seem to be anywhere else she should go. So in contemporary terms, I would say there should be protection against domestic abuse, of course. There should be the power that goes with having a culture and a law you can call upon against a domestic abuser. And there should be options. For example, homes for battered women, run ideally by a social movement of women. Nora didn't have those things. And that's why she was unfree in those terms, though having a kindly master. Second example, Les Miserables, Victor Hugo. You remember the worker who's basically blacklisted. He gets on the wrong side of his employer, who throws him out of work. There is no right, so to speak. He enjoys no right against being fired, being sacked at will by his employer. And having been thrown out of work, the employer, because there are a small number of employers, can tell other employers not to employ him, and so he's denied all access to work, and hence the theme of the play or the musical, if you prefer that version. Now, there's an example too of a worker who is subject to power. In his case, of course, he's actually interfered with. He's sacked, as it were, without reason. However, imagine that he wasn't. Imagine that he was like Nora in Thorvald's home. Imagine that he worked for an employer who was actually quite nice to him. It would still be the case in that world that Victor Hugo describes for us. It would still be the case that that worker was very much in the power of his employer. It would still be the case that did the employer throw his weight around, there wouldn't be much that the worker could do. Now, how is such a worker to be protected? Well, first of all, obviously by having a right against just being fired at will, and that's the problem with the temporary contract that we all know, for example, even in contemporary Spain, there is no such right under a temporary contract. I don't say that contracts of employment should be unbreakable, but I do think that there should be some possibility of contesting your being fired by your employer. But equally,